Hello and welcome to our IVF webinar as well. This time online patient meeting. In fact, apologies. And I'm glad to be back here with all of you. I would love to know where you're from and how are you feeling tonight. So do let me know if you can hear me properly. And with us tonight, we have another special guest. And hi, Andrew. I hope you can hear me as well.
I can. Evening, Caroline.
Perfect. Thank you so much for confirming this. And well, let me just start off with thanking everyone for joining us tonight. As you know, this is another topic that we had. We didn't have this before, so we are definitely excited to learn a bit more about surrogacy in South Africa. And I just want to remind everyone that all the events that are brought to you also has been brought to you thanks to our ambassadors and partners. And as always, I just want to simply thank them for their support. And as you can see, there are plenty of those ambassadors and partners. So huge thanks for them and huge thanks for their support. And tonight's definitely interesting topic we have ahead of us as we are connecting to Andrew Martin, and he's actually a founder and director of Fertility Law, but he's also an attorney at HART Fertility Clinic. We already had one webinar with one of the doctors from HART Fertility Clinic, which is located, as I mentioned, in Cape Town, South Africa. So it's really nice to be connected to Cape Town. And you, Andrew, thank you so much for joining our initiative. And I'm definitely excited to find out a bit more on surrogacy in South Africa and how it works. So happy to be able to do it with you tonight. How are you feeling?
Yeah, good. It's an interesting way of presenting a topic without any feedback from the people that you're talking to whilst talking, but I'm sure we can make a plan.
Exactly.
I see some familiar faces some familiar names in the attendees. Evening, Costa, and evening, Dr. Faison.
Excellent. Good evening then, of course, to you all. And well, just let us know. But I believe that if no one is writing, that means everyone can hear us. And that is the most important part. And let me just remind everyone that we will start with the introduction from Andrew. Later on, we will Andrew will answer those most common questions about surrogacy in South Africa. And right after that, it will be time for your questions. So remember, all you need to do is just simply type in the questions in the chat section, and I'm sure Andrew will be happy to answer them for you. And well, I guess we can start. Andrew, are you ready to begin?
Absolutely. Okay, so good evening, everyone. This is my first webinar that I've ever done, so please excuse if it is a little awkward. I do prefer to have some kind of interaction with my clients whilst talking, but will do my best to pretend that you're asking and answering questions and that I'm not going too fast. Okay, briefly about myself. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing for a little over 12 years now. I have been in the fertility assisted reproduction field since inception. I used to dabble in a little bit of commercial litigation, and about 3 or 4 years ago broke away and went on my own and started a boutique fertility law practice in Cape Town, South Africa. My speciality is the law relating to assisted reproduction only. It's my passion and my burning desire to help people get families. Having gone through IVF myself with my wife, I have an intimate knowledge of how the field works, as well as a deep passion for the legal aspects. Law in South Africa is really interesting because our law is kind of stuck in the past and very drafted from a very heterosexual perspective, and modern science and medicine and advances and the skills of our doctors in South Africa have made it an interesting field because there's a definite gap between our law and where our medical practitioners are. Okay, well, so tonight, obviously, we're talking about surrogacy in South Africa, which is a very hot topic and hugely in demand. Luckily, South Africa is one of the very few legal jurisdictions in the world that actually has a piece of legislation that regulates surrogacy in South Africa. We are lucky in that way because it gives us legal certainty, and it also sets out the requirements and what the consequences are of surrogacy, and it doesn't leave much in the way of problems or abuse that we've heard of overseas. So in South Africa, we have a piece of legislation called the Children's Act. It is our overarching piece of legislation that regulates everything relating to children, everything from parental rights and responsibilities of biological mothers and fathers to adoption, to inter-country adoption. And luckily, we have Chapter 19, which is our surrogacy regulation law. We went through an interesting stage in South Africa a number of years ago. The Children's Act was promulgated in 2007, but Chapter 19 only came into effect in 2010. So we had a time in South Africa where we knew what the law was going to say, but it wasn't in force and effect yet. And as a consequence, and similar to that, what happens in the UK, the surrogate mother would automatically obtain parental rights and responsibilities, and then the commissioning parents would have to go through a process of a known adoption through our legal courts with the assistance of a specialist adoption social worker, and then in essence adopt their own child. So this came to an end in 2010, which was great because the provisions of our Children's Act in Chapter 19 came into effect and required parties to undergo a full legal process prior to going through any form of artificial fertilization. Our legal process confirms parental rights and responsibilities from the moment of birth. It confirms that the registration of birth is done in the name of the commissioning parents from the moment of birth. It declares and confirms our surrogacy applications strictly confidential, with no publication allowed. It authorizes our doctors to perform the process of artificial fertilization. It coincidentally and recently we've started introducing a relief that we ask the court to confirm and transfer ownership in embryos back from the surrogate back to the commissioning parents. We have a very bizarre regulation to our National Health Act, which on a strict reading of it means that your surrogate becomes the owner of your embryos, but never really is acted upon. But in the surrogacy instance, we try and get the court to confirm that ownership remains with the commissioning parents. Our legal process is relatively simple once you tick the legal requirement boxes and you can show the court that you're considered a suitable person. And that your surrogate is a suitable person, but getting in and out of court in South Africa is a relatively quick and easy process. It does obviously depend on whether you fulfill the requirements or not. Once we have obtained a court order in South Africa, the authorization for artificial fertilization, that portion of the court order has a time limit attached to it, and that time limit is 18 months. So you have 18 months within which to get pregnant or get your surrogate pregnant and to complete your artificial fertilization process of your journey. It doesn't mean that you need to get pregnant or have an egg retrieval, have a fertilization, do an embryo transfer and get pregnant and have a child within 18 months. It just means you've got 18 months within which to do your embryo transfer and get pregnant. So in essence, some journeys in South Africa can last anywhere from 11 months as the quickest to all the way up to 27, 28 months. We are able to extend court orders should the parties continue to be in agreement to extend the court order authorizing artificial fertilization. Obviously, one of our biggest challenges in South Africa is the issue of finding surrogates. We are prohibited from payment being made to the surrogate for commercial surrogacy because commercial surrogacy is outlawed in South Africa. Surrogacy is meant to be done for altruistic reasons. So out of the goodness of your surrogate's heart, she is being your surrogate. Our law does allow for certain instances of payment, and those relate to issues such as medical costs, life insurance, loss of earnings on the part of the surrogate, reasonable expenses incurred by the surrogate, and then obviously legal and the actual payments made to the surrogate, to the medical practitioners. Any other payment which is made is considered illegal and carries with it a rather hefty criminal sanction. So in that sense, surrogates are relatively hard to come by, but surprisingly, we find a lot of women who are genuinely wanting to assist couples in having children. So it's just a matter of finding people and getting word out and explaining the process and procedures. And surprisingly, we haven't yet had a kind of a shortage or been unable to find surrogates in South Africa. Caroline, do you want to go through the general questions? I can keep talking for a relatively long period of time, but it might be better if it's a more kind of specific aspects I can address. And
of course, no problem. Thank you so much for that introduction. And yes, definitely we can go ahead with those most common questions, of course. And so the first one is right here. So what are the requirements for surrogacy in South Africa?
All right. So South Africa requires the parties to show that they are suitable persons to be considered parents. Our legislation and the courts haven't quite defined what exactly a suitable person is, or what determines or dictates or makes a person a suitable parent. So there's no standing requirement that you must have X amount in your bank account, you must live in this area or suburb. What we provide to the court and what the court has been satisfied with since surrogacy inception in 2010 is that we do a relatively thorough psychological screening of the commissioning parents. Often the psychological assessment takes on a rather social worker style assessment with pictures and a description of living environments, although some judges, most judges and some courts don't require this, but predominantly what we are looking for is to assess any psychological or psychiatric issues that might preclude a person from being a suitable parent. An example might be being diagnosed with schizophrenic multiple personal disorder that presents itself as an aggressive individual, something really random. Predominantly, we are able to explain things like currently being treated for anxiety, or I've had a mild bout of depression in the past. Those things don't really play a huge part. So we provide the court with a relatively detailed psychological report and assessment, and then there are various medical requirements that we need to show the court that require you to have a surrogacy, and these include that at least one of the commissioning parents, either one of the fathers or both the fathers or the mother and the father or the mother, are genetically linked to the child. At least one of them must be. Our constitutional court has recently ruled that this is not an infringement of the parties' constitutional rights. So if both parties are unable to be genetically linked, then unfortunately surrogacy isn't an option. So have to be genetically linked. The mother or the parties must have what they term a condition which is considered permanent and irreversible and which prevents them from carrying a child. It's a relatively unpolitically correct way of saying people can't have children, especially when we have same-sex male couples using surrogacy, because to call it a condition which is permanent, irreversible is not really correct. But ultimately, the doctor then confirms that, for instance, in the case of a heterosexual couple, the wife has had a hysterectomy or something which then prevents her from proceeding with surrogacy. So genetically linked, have a condition which is permanent and irreversible. The doctors also go through a very thorough screening process, test for HIV and STDs and any other transmissible issues. Similarly, for the surrogate, we also check that she's a suitable person, that she has one living child of her own, that both commissioning parents and surrogate parents don't have a criminal background, and also that the surrogate gets tested for transmissible disorders, HIV and STDs. Then the one requirement which is interesting is that the documentation must be in writing, and it must be documents be written and entered into in South Africa. So that requires parties to be present in South Africa when signing surrogacy agreements and the affidavits which we then present to the court. The parties have to be present in South Africa. A further requirement, which is obviously a relative sticking point for most couples doing surrogacy in South Africa, is this issue of one of the commissioning parents must be domiciled within South Africa. And domicile is a very interesting concept for them to have used in legislation, because it's relatively open for interpretation, because it has what we call a subjective element and inquiry to it, which relates to the intention of the parties. So we need to show the court that a person is physically present or has been physically present in the past in South Africa, and that they have an intention to reside in South Africa at some point in the future indefinitely. So once we are able to show suitability from a psychological, criminal, and medical perspective, then we're able to proceed with a surrogacy, and obviously that we have entered into the relevant documentation in South Africa. So those are the requirements.
Perfect. Thank you so much for providing those details. Definitely interesting and good to simply remember, of course, as well. Okay, next question is then, how do I find a surrogate in South Africa?
So, yeah, so unfortunately, I wish the law would change in this respect, but it prohibits there being surrogacy agencies in South Africa, and it prohibits the ability of a person to source and charge commissioning parents for finding surrogates. So there isn't this industry in South Africa that goes out and sources surrogates. Predominantly, how people find surrogates is either the fertility clinic has been approached by women being surrogate or wanting to be a surrogate. Predominantly, some egg donors become interested in being surrogates. Obviously, the fertility clinics, the egg donor agencies, old surrogates, returning surrogates, have friends. Social media is used hugely in South Africa, Facebook, Instagram. There are some international websites which cater for finding of surrogates, but and then my practice, we try and assist parents in finding surrogates, just purely because we are in the industry and are often contacted by girls who are interested in being surrogates and helping people out. So in some instances and where we can, we try and help find people, but predominantly parents have to go through websites which provide services and matching of surrogates, but there are obviously problems associated with finding women through those sites. And then social media and Facebook. Facebook seems to be a very big place to find surrogates. Yeah. Caroline?
All right, perfect. Thank you so much again for that. And well, let's have a look at the next question. So what is the screening process with regard to surrogates and commissioning parents in South Africa?
Okay, so I'll repeat myself, although I did answer myself from the suitability aspect. So when we try and source surrogates as much as we can, we start by sending a surrogate off for a social worker assessment. So she chats with a social worker who specifically specializes in surrogacy and also in the egg donor industry. So they are very experienced with talking to potential egg donors and surrogates. They provide us with initial feedback on whether they think that the surrogate would be a suitable person. We send them off for a battery of medical tests. Dr. Faison, who's a participant here, can confirm exactly what the blood tests are that we go through, but they go for a full gynecological screening, internal examination, various blood screening tests, and obviously HIV, STDs. And then once they've passed the medical, then we move on to the very thorough psychological assessment, which is completed prior to the court process. What we are starting to encourage people, once screened, is to actually continue seeing the psychologist on an ongoing monthly, quarterly basis during the currency of your journey, to ensure that parties are coping well with the surrogacy journey. But the screening process involves the medical and the psychological, and as well as the criminal background checks that are done.
Perfect. Thank you once again for answering this question. And well, let's get to the next one. What is the total cost of the process and what do I pay my surrogate in South Africa?
Okay, so interestingly enough, I consulted with two commissioning parents this morning, and both of them asked the exact same question. Often surrogacy in South Africa, it's very difficult to give people an exact estimate of what it is going to be. I see from looking at the American industry of surrogacy, they're very much able to say your surrogacy is going to cost you X amount of US dollars, and that's what you pay from start to finish. There are various monthly costs that are associated with surrogacy that you are able to, budget for. These costs are, and they relate to medical aid. Commissioning parents are required to cover all medical costs associated with the surrogacy and the pregnancy and the birth. So what we do is that we ensure that the surrogate then takes out a medical aid, and that the commissioning parents then cover the costs of the monthly premium for the medical aid. That, depending on the level of cover one takes out, is approximately between 2,500 to 3,000 Rand a month. We also take out a life insurance and disability cover, which predominantly covers the surrogate for about 2 million Rand in the event of her death or disability. They come in at about 350 to 400 Rand a month. Loss of earnings is paid to the surrogate should she suffer any loss of earnings as a result. This really then just depends on whether your surrogate is employed and what her salary is. The surrogacy contracts tend to break her loss of earnings into monthly, weekly, daily, hourly loss of earnings, and she then just provides proof of loss of earnings. And then we have this concept of reasonable expenses incurred as a result of the surrogacy. So those vary on a month-to-month basis, but predominantly they tend to come in at about 6,000 to 8,000 Rand a month, and they are paid towards additional nutritional requirements, vitamins, scar tissue creams, cell phone expenses, travel expenses, domestic help, clothing allowance, and any other reasonable necessary expenses that you as the commissioning parents would like your surrogates to incur. Medical costs vary clinic to clinic. It really just depends on the number of IVF rounds that you're required to do, or the number of frozen embryo transfers that you're required to do, whether you're going to use an egg donor or whether you're not going to use an egg donor. So clinic costs vary. And then, okay, so those monthly costs I mentioned would start from the first of the month following on your court order date, and would continue for the duration of your journey, and until approximately 2 months post-birth, or until she's declared healthy. So there's an element of monthly installments which are paid, and then medical expenses up front, and then there are also the ad hoc screening expenses during the pregnancy, NIPT tests, fetal assessment centers, various gynecological obstetrician costs. Legal costs can vary. It really just depends. They sometimes vary between 50 and 50,000 Rand and up. Medical costs, as I said, they vary clinic to clinic, so they can vary, and it really then just depends on the type of treatment you do, but they vary from, I unfortunately had a couple now who told me that during their journey they did 18 rounds of IVF and were still unsuccessful, so they paid hundreds of thousands of rands in medical costs. I've had a couple who have luckily got pregnant on their first round and got triplets as a result. So it really just depends, but medical costs vary anything from about 50 to 60,000 Rand and up.
Excellent. Thank you once again for providing those details. Definitely a question that might actually come up later on as well. But thank you so much for that. And now it will be our last question when it comes to those most common ones. So therefore, we will go for your questions. If you have any, just go ahead and type it in so that Andrew can help you out a bit as well. And the question is, so how does the legal side of surrogacy take in South Africa?
How long does the legal side of surrogacy in South
Yes,
Africa?
that's right. Sorry.
Yeah,
True.
my typing. Okay, so as I explained to commissioning parents, the legal side of surrogacy in South Africa should not take very long. I've heard that times it takes between 6 to 8 months to get the legal side of the process done. Predominantly, the delay in the surrogacy journey is finding the surrogate. That can take months, if not a year or two, to find. Predominantly, it should take you a couple of months, but once you've found your surrogate, you shouldn't take longer than approximately 2 to 3 months to get all of the screening procedures, the finalization of the surrogacy agreement, and the court documentation done and into court. It depends in which jurisdiction we were to bring the application. If it were Cape Town, Johannesburg, Durban, Pretoria, the courts tend to work on a relatively different scheduling system. The Western Cape High Court in Cape Town is predominantly the fastest court to be able to get through. So we're able to pick the day on which we would like to bring a surrogacy application and then approach the judge a day and a half before the court application is to be heard in motion court, and then he or she will decide when she would like to hear the matter. Predominantly, it's done on the day in question. Durban, Pretoria, and Johannesburg, we take files to the relevant deputy judge president, who then allocates the file to a sitting judge, who then himself or herself determines when the matter will be heard. So that provides a slight delay in the matter of about 2 to 3 weeks. But all in all, you shouldn't, the legal side of your journey shouldn't take more than 4 or 5 months. It really also just depends on the speed at which commissioning parents want to move. So some want to move slowly, some want to move fast.
Understood perfectly. Thank you so much once again for answering that question. Now we will go for your questions. So let me once again encourage everyone to type in your questions if you have any, of course, so that Andrew can help you out. And we do have the first question. So if you could explain, there's a question here. So who needs to reside in South Africa? It's regards to your answer, the surrogate or also the future parents or even egg donor?
Okay, and thanks for the question. So South Africa's law, and this is where the interesting thing comes in. It says, reside implies resident or citizen, which is not necessarily the case. It says that one needs to be domiciled. At least one of the commissioning parents must be domiciled within South Africa. The Act further says that the surrogate should be domiciled within South Africa, but the court has the authority to waive that requirement. So you can have a foreign surrogate in South Africa. Obviously, you run, and predominantly talking from South African parents' perspective, in having a foreign surrogate, you run the risk of your surrogate being overseas or in a foreign jurisdiction where your medical aid cover might not cover you for medical costs, and where medical costs might be prohibitively expensive. So it can happen that you have a foreign surrogate. I do have a couple of cases where we are approaching the court to waive the requirement of foreign surrogates, but it's not relatively that common. Egg donors, it doesn't matter where your egg donor is from, to be honest. Lots of people travel with, there's a large industry of traveling donors. Your domicile certainly doesn't need to be, your egg donor certainly doesn't need to be living in South Africa. They can be a foreign national.
All right, thank you so much once again for that question. In fact, as well as your answer to that. Okay, and so next question is here. So what are your legal fees?
It's a very pointed question, my friend. Look, predominantly legal fees are charged on an hourly basis. So my hourly rate is 2,600 Rand an hour. We try and cap fees and try not to let legal fees run away from people, but legal fees you can look, and it really just depends on the complexity of your surrogacy matter, but they start anywhere from about 65,000 Rand all the way up. I've had to deal with some very complicated surrogacies with people coming in from Cyprus who needed rectification, and unfortunately their legal bills ran into 100 or 200,000 Rand. But predominantly it's on the cheaper side of things. We try and ensure that costs are manageable by people and discussed and agreed to upfront.
All right. Thank you so much for answering this one, of course. And I just added this question because actually this is a question I receive quite often in regards to other countries as well. So can intended parents be in touch with the
Absolutely.
surrogate with her? How does it get done?
Okay, so predominantly what happens is that once you find a surrogate or you are introduced to a surrogate by a third party or your clinic, then you would be responsible for managing your relationship with your surrogate through the journey. So you predominantly would start with a telephone consultation with your surrogate to see whether there's commonality between the two of you, and then it is certainly encouraged that you meet her in person, um, and then continue a relationship with your surrogate throughout the duration of your journey. I I explain to commissioning parents that we as human beings are so used to these preconceived kind of relationships that we have. So we have an employer-employee relationship, which everyone is used to. We have this friend relationship. We have this lover-partner relationship, and so people predominantly try and stick their relationship with their surrogate into one of these boxes. And in reality, what one finds is that each situation is different and gets treated, and you've got to develop your type of relationship with your surrogate. So some commissioning parents want a very active involvement with their surrogacy journey. Some commissioning parents don't want any active involvement. My advice kind of thinking for commissioning parents is to think of it from a preferred supplier relationship. If you were a business and you had a very good supplier that you did business with, you don't invite your supplier over for Friday night family dinners and he or she doesn't come to your house on a Sunday. You don't necessarily send really personal WhatsApp messages between each other, but you have a really cordial, friendly relationship. You go out for coffee every now and then. You have the odd lunch, but in reality, you tend to keep your preferred supplier at arm's length. The reality of this journey is that at the end of your surrogacy journey, you're predominantly going to cut ties with your surrogate. And if you've been too close with your surrogate, it does tend to cause emotional problems at the end of your journey. So you're in constant contact with your surrogate. There isn't, and you certainly do meet and continually chat and talk with. You're present at most of the scans and you're present at the birth.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That definitely sounds good and encouraging as well, because this is a question, as I mentioned, I always got. So thank you so much for answering this one. And the next question is, are there any age limits for CP?
Are there any age limits for commissioning parents? There aren't, surprisingly. The court has the discretion to decide whether a parent or parents are suitable parents. Now, as explained, suitability isn't defined and hasn't been regulated. I have had commissioning fathers in their 70s, surprisingly, with the court making mention of the fact that they are relatively old, but still providing and granting the court order. So there isn't an age limit. I think it would really depend on the judge in question and whether both commissioning parents are elderly or whether it is just one of the commissioning parents that's elderly. I think the court would look at the age of the commissioning parents in light of them having a child. So if both commissioning parents were in their, I've never had one, but if both were in their 60s, then potentially the court might have a problem if they both are. But there isn't an official age limit for commissioning parents.
Excellent. Thank you once again for answering that question. And there are more coming already. So, so you have already answered that. I just will show you. So there is no age limit, just to confirm, right?
No, Mark, there isn't an age limit.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. Next question is right here. So hello, Andrew. Thank you for providing your information. And could you say from what period and for what duration one of the extended parents need to be in South Africa?
All right, thanks, Summer. Look, the issue of domicile is something that needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. There isn't predominantly a set period which is regulated by any regulation. It is really a hard question to answer. One would need to look at the circumstances surrounding connection to South Africa and whether one has been or is intending to be in South Africa. So if you were intending this, to be honest, I would suggest that you get in touch with me directly, and we can look at the circumstances and the facts surrounding it. But predominantly, you would have had to have been in South Africa. The court hasn't specified an exact time period, length of time that one would need to be. But predominantly, what we're finding at present is that people were either born in South Africa and they've moved away, or they were born elsewhere and they've obtained South African citizenship and they went to, say, high school in South Africa. Those are the kind of general things that we see when the issue of domicile is presented.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that question as well as your answer to that. Next question is quite specific. So how have you, so if you have separate parents been able to use a surrogate in South Africa given the residency requirements?
Yeah, unfortunately, they weren't able to. They were, unfortunately, there has been instances of illegal surrogacy being undertaken in South Africa where court orders were fraudulently issued by a person in South Africa, and they've impacted a number of couples from Greece, Cyprus, and some other European countries that were unfortunately taken advantage of. We were able to rectify their court orders. So that's when I talk of Cypriot parents, I was rectifying parent surrogacy applications for them. But predominantly, one needs to show domicile in order to approach our courts.
Okay, thank you for clarifying this. And now we have a bit of a longer question, and here it is. Is the process of surrogate, can it and I take my sister to be my surrogate as she's already living in South Africa and it is less expensive as I will have my own surrogate? About the legal rights, am I allowed to fly back to the Netherlands with a child? Is not that difficult as I did not have give birth myself, and how many times I have to appear to the court?
Okay. So yes, your sister can certainly be your surrogate. From a cost perspective, it might reduce your costs ever so slightly from a reasonable expenses perspective, but medical aid, life insurance, loss of earnings, those expenses are predominantly going to be the same, as well as medical and legal expenses. Once you obtain a court order through a South African court for surrogacy, the child is legally your child from the moment of birth, and your name is then recorded on the child's birth certificate. So the issue of traveling back to a different country or obtaining a foreign passport is something that would need to be addressed with the specific country. But predominantly what happens is that just prior to birth in South Africa, we provide, well, you provide the duly issued court order, copies of IDs and passports to the Home Affairs official who is working at that specific hospital. The relevant forms are filled out for the registration of the birth. And once the child is born alive and confirmed to be born alive, then that birth is then registered at Home Affairs and a birth certificate is issued. That birth certificate is then used to go and obtain the relevant passport needed for travel. So it really isn't a question of whether you gave birth to the child or not. It's just a matter of having the relevant documentation to travel with the child. So passport, birth certificate, and then you'd be able to travel. Obviously, you'd be limited by how old the child is to travel. I think there's a mandatory limitation of 1 month, 6 weeks old to travel internationally, but you'd have to address that directly with the carrier that you intend flying back with. And then you don't necessarily need to appear in court. Our courts don't require commissioning parents to appear in court. Myself and my advocate appear in court on the day in question.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much for your question and, well, your advice on that as well. And next question is here. Does the High Court ever reject an application? What are most common reasons for rejection?
In my 12 years of doing surrogacy, I have had one court application rejected. Predominantly, we ensure that we have fulfilled all the requirements prior to approaching the court. But in one instance of a rejection, the commissioning father had failed to disclose a very serious previous criminal conviction, which coincidentally the judge who was hearing the matter knew about. So the judge was of the opinion that the commissioning father was not a suitable person for surrogacy and therefore rejected and refused the application. But other than that, we don't, to be honest, we don't approach the court until we are fully satisfied that the court application complies with the legal requirements. And having been in the industry for so long, we know what the court will want and what the court doesn't want. And if there are issues with our papers, then we specifically address them by way of affidavit. So predominantly, if we go to court, you should get a court order.
All right. Thank you so much once again for that then. Next question is in regards to the guarantee programs. So I also often receive that. So are there any guarantee programs available when it comes to the surrogacy?
Not that I'm aware of. The problem again with South African surrogacy is that it is uncommercialized. So there is no commercial benefit for people to, I would assume, to do guarantee programs. I have heard of IVF guarantee schemes, but when it comes to surrogacy, there isn't. Not in South Africa.
Not in South Africa. Thank you again for confirming that. We do have one more question, but I just want to encourage everyone, if you have any left, just go ahead and type it in. This is your chance to simply ask your question. So just go ahead and do it. I would like to know, because as I've mentioned, again, this is a question that I received quite a lot in regards to the patients from Germany where surrogacy is banned. So have you got have you had any patients from Germany? And if so, how did it work?
I haven't had any patients from Germany but that interesting concept, we are in the process of approaching the court now to authorize artificial fertilization for a surrogacy for foreign nationals with their own foreign surrogate who are just wanting to do treatment in South Africa. So predominantly this instance relates to, say, couples from an African country where they don't have the requisite medical fertility practices. So they are traveling to South Africa to do artificial fertilization and surrogacy. So we have to approach the court for an authorization to allow the doctors to perform artificial fertilization. But one of the requirements that we are going to ensure that we show the court is that surrogacy is not outlawed or illegal in the country from which they are coming from. So if you were in your instance of a German national, I would assume that you would not be able to proceed in South Africa because you're trying to circumvent your German restrictions by coming to South Africa. And we'd need to be open and honest with the court.
Okay, understood, of course. Thank you so much. This is definitely interesting to know. And of course, I believe so there are countries like that will have quite similar problems. So therefore, that is why I ask, of course. Someone is typing, so I just definitely want to make sure that we are having some questions. Someone also mentioned, I'm not sure if you see it, that there is one Redia in London. They do offer guarantee live birth or refund with a clinic in South Africa. So I guess some of them possibly do it, but of course, thank you for that comment as well then. Okay, and next question is right here. Is there a limit of the number of pregnancies that the surrogate can go through?
Look, okay, so the court order is valid for 18 months. So predominantly what we are finding is that surrogates go through one pregnancy within the 18-month period. Again, wording of our legislation doesn't necessarily prohibit a surrogate getting pregnant, having a child, and still falling within the 18-month period and then being able to do a second pregnancy. we find that a lot of our clinics are relatively conservative in procedures post cesarean section. So if your surrogate would go through, have a C-section, some clinics err on the side of caution and they say 6 to 12 months between C-sections. So it really depends. It would depend on the circumstances. I'm of the opinion that after your birth, in terms of the court order, one would need to approach the court for a second order to ensure that everyone is re-psychologically assessed and medical assessments are redone, just to ensure that everyone is still on the same page and compliant.
All right. Excellent. Thank you so much. I am just checking if we have any questions left. If not, we will be finishing, but I just want to make sure that you have asked all of your questions. If you did, then I guess we will be able to finish. But in the meantime, Andrew, is there anything that you would like to add? Anything at all that that perhaps you haven't mentioned, although there were plenty of interesting information you already have provided to us.
Yeah, no. Unless someone has a very specific question, but I'm obviously open to answering questions. If you'd like to drop me an email, I'm certainly willing to answer any questions you have. I also have WhatsApp available through the website, so or we can schedule another time to chat if we get a host more specific questions.
Of course, not a problem. And I just want to remind everyone that if you would like to simply ask some more detailed question even, remember you can also use this link that I have just sent to you, and that way you can ask your question directly to Andrew and he will get back to you. I am definitely sure. Well, I guess we will be finishing for today. Andrew, thank you so much for your expertise, for providing all those details in regards to surrogacy in South Africa, because this is definitely an interesting topic. And thank you for giving us some more, let's say, details and information. For me, it was definitely interesting. As I've mentioned, this is our first time topic. So huge thank you for joining our initiative and being with us tonight. As you can see, there are some thank yous from our patients already as well. That was very informative.
I enjoy helping. So
excellent. Thank you so much.
Having gone through IVF myself, I know what one would get out of it. So
even well, because of that, I believe that you are always eager to help as well, right? Well, you definitely were helpful tonight. So again, huge thanks for that. And I just want to remind everyone that this has been recorded, so of course you will have a chance to watch this again. If you are going to just simply follow us on our YouTube channel, that way you will be notified when the new video is uploaded. So I can only encourage you to do it. And all of our events can be found on myivfanswers.com. There are also all the upcoming events. So all you need to do is just go ahead and register. And I definitely want to invite everyone for our next webinar, which will start at 8 p.m. UK time. This time it will be surrogacy in USA. So kind of different part of the world. So I'm really excited to have this another webinar as well. Andrew, once again, huge thank you for joining us tonight, and have a pleasant evening. And I definitely hope we will be able to simply have another topic to discuss pretty soon as well.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Bye,
good night,
everyone.
Everybody. Good night. Bye-bye.